Hey everyone, my name is Jack, and I'm a 23-year-old real estate investor and soon-to-be attorney, and on this channel I cover a variety of topics as they relate to real estate, investing, the markets, and pretty much everything as it has to do with personal finance. So if you like that sort of content, be sure to have a look around the channel, and if you like what you see, be sure to subscribe. But in today's video, I want to talk about the student loan crisis and the proposed solutions that we're starting to hear more about with the upcoming Biden administration, of course assuming Joe Biden does officially win the presidency, which is still technically up for debate. But either way, many politicians have advocated for things like student loan relief and waiving loans and changing the student loan system. So there's a lot of proposed solutions to this very, very big problem. Because recently Senate Democrats have tried to persuade Joe Biden, if he is to take the presidency, to waive up to $50,000 in student loans per person who has them across the United States. Now, just so you know where I'm coming from on this issue, I do have student loans that I'm responsible for. Between my wife and I, we have $90,000 in student debt. That number is actually still rising since my wife is in grad school right now, but we have a lot of debt to take care of nonetheless. And we're certainly not alone in this, since 45 million Americans currently have student debt, and in total there's about $1.6 trillion in student debt outstanding as of right now. This brings the average amount of debt for anyone who does have any student loan debt to $20,000 to $25,000. That is a very huge burden on many people, especially because student loans often can't be discharged in bankruptcy, so there's really no escaping them that way. And it's not like you can just foreclose on them like you would with a real estate mortgage, which is attached to a property. These things really stay with people, and you have to pay them off without facing really dire consequences. And I'm talking about dire consequences financially. I'm not talking about throwing people into the gulag, because thankfully the United States is not there yet. But the point is, this is a massive problem. There are a lot of people with lots of student loan debt. It's a huge burden on much of the economy, but the reason it's a burden is often misunderstood, I think, or at least the argument is a distraction from what the true problem is. The first assumption that many people make is that college degrees are necessary to actually move forward in society, which is patently false. This isn't to say that some degree programs are beneficial to people who really make the most out of them, or it's something that they really like and want to get into, and in some cases it is an actual barrier to entry for things like law or medicine. But in many cases, if all you want is financial success, which is a big reason for many people who go to college in the first place, then you don't necessarily need a college degree to find that financial success. Oftentimes, politicians or supporters of things like waiving student loans argue that it is absolutely necessary, that you need a college degree to advance in this society, but that is not true. It is a narrative that's often spun, and I think it's spun very irresponsibly, and usually for political gain. Again, not saying that all degrees are bad, but to suggest that they are necessary for any amount of financial success is simply not true. And this assumption leads into the next thing, which is that people are forced to go to college, or that it somehow wasn't their choice to take on this debt. I know this is a hot button issue for some reason, but when someone goes to college, they are doing it voluntarily. Whether they actually knew what they were doing when they were doing it is a different story. But to suggest that someone else now needs to pay for the college, even though you made the voluntary choice to go to college and take out the debt and take that risk, is really just unfair to those people who didn't go to college and didn't make that same choice. And this leads into the next major assumption that people make, and that's that waiving student loans wouldn't have a negative effect on anything. They argue that it would unlock spending for all these people who had student loans, since they wouldn't have to pay the government back, and instead could use that money in the economy and foster spending and start businesses and invest and buy things. And while much of that is true, it's not as though there isn't a cost on the other side. The $1.6 trillion in student loans is an asset on the government's balance sheet. It expects that money to come back at some point. Now, whether it actually does all come back is certainly not always the case. In fact, a recent study shows that about $400 billion of the current $1.6 trillion probably will never be paid back, even with the current rules and with no student loan waivers. So the government's already going to take a big loss in this, but what is the effect of that loss? And what's the effect of the loss if they multiplied even more by waiving all student loans? Or the proposed $50,000 per person that some Senate Democrats and potentially President Biden are at least thinking about. In all likelihood, you'd have a significant inflationary event. In a way, this would be like the government taking $1.6 trillion in cash and throwing it into the economy, this cash being newly printed from something like the Fed. The government, and by extension the taxpayers, would take a $1.6 trillion loss on all of the student loans that would have been waived, maybe a little bit less than that since not everyone has $50,000 in student loans. Many have much more than that, so not all of their loans would be waived, but we could could probably safely guess that most student loans would be waived under that idea. Someone has to pay that cost in some way, and when it's really going to be paid for is with inflation. The government took out money to actually issue the loan in the first place. Once that loan is waived, it's as though all of that money is unlocked and no longer has to go towards government loan payments and can just be used throughout the economy. Spending would naturally rise dramatically, but it's not as though new value has been created. All the government has done is said that, hey, you can keep that money that we gave you a while back, you don't need to pay us back. That's going to have an inflationary effect. People are going to have much more money to spend despite producing nothing else in return to actually get that money in the first place. All they did was ask the government for it a while back. It would be sort of like a delayed inflation, whereas the money was produced a while back and was spent on education, which has definitely in part driven up the cost of education because of such easy access to loans. Now you're just going to have it spread throughout the economy more since the person doesn't actually have to pay that loan back anymore out of their income, which now can be used towards spending on whatever it is they want. And don't get me wrong, that'd be a sweet deal for many students, but for anyone who doesn't have student loans, it is very much a bad deal. They are going to have to face higher prices, whether that be higher asset prices, higher consumer prices, higher debt prices, whatever it happens to be, it's going to be very expensive because you have more demand for spending and more demand for new types of debt. That's going to have a larger effect on the greater economy. It's not as though it's a free lunch to waive all these student loans. And even worse, oftentimes people with degrees and who are more likely to have student loans probably are slightly higher earners than people without them in many cases. And now you're giving those people a sort of stimulus welfare check by waiving their student loans, potentially very large welfare boost up to 50 grand, and you're not giving anything to people without student loans who might be making a lot less and could actually use that money a lot more than someone who has a higher income, and all they get is inflation in return. The decision to waive student loans needs to be looked at very carefully, and it can't be looked at through the lens of, oh, this will just make my life easier. It's going to have a huge effect on the overall economy. While this will help a comparatively privileged class of people who have been able to go to college, whether they finished or not, who knows, but they have student loans, so they had to at some point have gone to school. You're helping those people at the expense of those people who don't have those loans, who often are lower earners, unfortunately. And you could cherry pick cases that would say otherwise, but I'm looking at the aggregate here. What would the net effect be on the overall economy and the overall budget of the US? All of that said, I do think the student loan issue is a big problem. I just don't think waiving all of the loans is the real solution. I think the first step towards a solution of this problem is to actually cut off the flow of many new loans that are being issued. Because unfortunately, many degrees have proven that they do not actually yield any sort of financial return, so all the government is really doing is subsidizing a degree that's not going to lead to any more production in the economy. Those degrees should not get such easy access to debt. Even though it might be a passion of a student, the government's job is not to fund passions. The government's job, when it's lending at least, should be to fund productivity and to help people who are actually in need. No one actually needs a useless degree. You could definitely argue that there is a role for government, and thus the taxpayer, to subsidize people who are disadvantaged and otherwise couldn't afford college. That could make sense. But to suggest that someone should get the same loan terms and the same amount of debt as someone who is getting a comparatively much better financial degree and has a much higher chance of paying the debt back, I think is quite inefficient and really is not good policy. All degrees are not created equal, so we should not treat them equally when it comes to lending on them, especially when taxpayer money is at stake. Or more accurately, whenever inflation via Fed money is at stake. And also by cutting off many of the loans to useless degrees, colleges would have much more pressure to lower their costs since you wouldn't have so many willing buyers for degrees that aren't actually going to pay anything in the long run. You'd probably lower the amount of people who end up getting less productive degrees, which likely would lower the demand for college in general and would thus lower the price. Because right now, colleges have it great. They basically have an unlimited pool of buyers to get whatever degree they want to offer, and they seem to offer it at any price they want to offer it at, and that's super expensive. It ends up being a burden on the economy because people have this false assumption that they need a degree to be successful. I think the more we can scale back many of the federally subsidized student loan programs, probably the better for the overall system. This isn't to say that it's a perfect system. Every system's going to have drawbacks. Yes, you'd have less people who would be able to get degrees, but that would lower the cost of degrees over the aggregate and would help more people out in that way. Every decision has a cost. That's why no system is perfect, since every move is going to have a sort of equal opposite reaction on the other end. While I personally would enjoy having $50,000 of my wife and I's student loans waived, it's not as though that would be a great thing for the overall system or that it wouldn't have any sort of cost. I hope this video at least helped to offer some different perspectives perspective on what waiving student loans would do to the economy and why it's not necessarily a great idea, and definitely why it has actual costs associated with it. There is no such thing as a free lunch, and waiving student loans is no different. Anyways, if you like this video, please like it since it helps the channel out a lot, and if you like this sort of content about the economy, investing, real estate, the markets, and pretty much everything as it has to do with personal finance, definitely subscribe so you don't miss any new videos since I put out new videos every single week. And check out my book, The One Property Retirement, about a simple strategy for building your retirement nest egg using real estate. It's great for beginners who might be new to the real estate buying process since it takes you from the very beginning of a deal, running the numbers and vetting the deal, through the closing process and beyond to maintaining and renting out the property. If you end up reading the book, definitely leave a review on Amazon since that would help me out a lot. But until next time, take care.